Hello everybody. Let's talk about demand. To understand how demand works, we need to start with something called quantity demanded. And you might recall that the definition of quantity demanded is this is the amount of good, service, or resource that people are willing and able to buy during a specified period at a specified price. So I'm not going to write it down. Hopefully you already look in the textbook, or maybe you already have it in your notes. But simply put, quantity demanded is a number, right? It's telling us how much of stuff someone is buying, again, during a specified period of time at a specified price. So it's a number. And it can refer to a single person, could refer to household, local market, regional market, national market, even like global market. So it's just telling us how much of particular stuff is flowing through those households or markets while being consumed by people. So we know that these numbers are affected by various things, right? So what will affect the amount of stuff people are buying? And the first thing on our list is price. And what we're going to do now, we're going to see how price affects quantity demanded. So this is what this diagram basically does. On the vertical axis, we have price. On the horizontal axis, we have quantity. First thing to notice here that price actually is what we call an independent variable. So price comes first. Quantity is supposed to respond to price, at least in this type of model. And usually, like in math, we put independent variable on the horizontal axis and dependent variable on the vertical axis. Remember, this is x, this is typically y, and again, x comes first, y just follows x. So the way it's done here is different. So price comes first, but it shows on the vertical axis. Q follows price, but it shows on the horizontal axis. So we need to pay attention to this. And in the future, it's actually gonna make quite a bit of difference of the way we're looking at it. But simply put, at this point, when it comes to quantity, an increase in quantity shows as a rightward move along the horizontal axis. So quantity technically on this diagram is not going up when it increases, but it's actually going further right. If quantity decreases, we go left, all right? And this is what happens when you move along the horizontal axis, and this is where we have Q, quantity demanded. Then another thing we need to notice here, which I think is pretty intuitive, is that we have this downward sloping curve that indicates the relationship between price and quantity. So the higher the price, the lower the quantity. So if you start with price at this point, P1, then if you trace it to the demand curve, you can see that we will have that much demanded. So quantity demanded at this price will be this number. If price is higher, if it goes up, then we move along the demand curve. So quantity demanded shrinks. So this quantity, this number is smaller than this one. If price actually drops, then quantity demanded increases. And that's basically how things work when you're dealing with a downward sloping curve. All right, so the whole curve is what we call the demand curve. Next very important thing is to realize that this demand curve is defined assuming that all other things except price and quantity demanded itself, they stay the same. And in fact, there are a bunch of factors that might affect how much stuff people are buying besides price. So to make sense out of this diagram, we need to assume that all other factors stay fixed. So what these factors might be? Well, just let's just take one, for example, income. So income affects quantity, right? So other things staying the same, including price, people will usually buy more, not always. There's something called inferior goods, but we'll get to this later. But if we're talking about something called normal goods, the higher the income, the more stuff people will buy. Other things staying the same. So that means that if we define this demand curve D1, we need to fix income at certain level. So let's say we fixed it at, I don't know, $30,000. So this is how people will respond to changes in price if the income or income in the area is $30,000. Now, what if income actually goes up? Well, that means that, again, assuming we're dealing with a normal good, people will be buying more, right? That's what we usually do. If we have more money, we buy more stuff. So people will buy more at any given price, which means that every point on this initial demand curve will shift further right. Because if price was here and income increased, people will buy more. Maybe somewhere here. If price was here and income increased, still people will be buying more. So no matter which price we're talking about, an increase in income will always result in larger quantity that people are buying, again, assuming that we're talking about something called normal good. So by changing income for normal good, we also need to shift demand curve further right. So that will be demand when income is, let's say, I don't know, $35,000. All right. So, and this is how things generally work when something else except for the price of the good changes. So it's very important to understand the difference between changes in price and how they affect things on this diagram, and changes in any other factor that actually influences people willingness to buy stuff. So if it's price, we basically move along a given demand curve as we just saw here, right? And as income got adjusted and we found ourselves at a new demand curve, same rule will apply regarding price. So when we're sitting on this demand curve, given that income is now higher, changes in price will move us along this given demand curve. So if price goes from P1 to P2, we will go to this point, right? So actually quantity shrink from here to here. I can even show it for you. So the same rule applies regarding what they call the law of demand. People will be responding to changes in prices, well, in a negative way. So price goes up, quantity demanded goes down, and vice versa. But when income changes, so we move from another demand curve, things will be happening on a different demand curve. All right. So, and all these factors, except for price of the good itself, they are called shift factors, or at least it's a nice way to call them, because changes in those factors basically shift demand curve. So now let's talk about those shift factors. And I don't want to spend too much time. I've been talking for 10 minutes already. So, well, very, very briefly. So we already covered income. And here you have to be careful remembering that there are normal goods versus inferior goods. Preferences definitely matter. Preferences, well, as something get more popular, demand increases, which means demand curve moves further right. And if something gets out of fashion, demand decreases, so demand curve shifts further left. What else do we have? Well, I mean, I'm just not sure where to start. So income preferences, well, let's jump to prices of related goods. Prices of related goods. Well, I mean, I probably shouldn't rush too much. I mean, I think I can talk for 20 minutes without you guys falling asleep. So let's make sure we cover what we need to cover. So prices of related goods. How goods could be related to each other? Well, they could be either substitutes or they could be complements. And substitutes basically goods that we can replace, for each other. Examples, actually any good related any two goods belonging to the same category usually make up an example of two substitutes. So two fruits will substitute each other because by definition, well, if you feel like having a piece of fruit, well, you will go for one or the other. So apples and oranges, for most people, they substitute each other. Apples and pears and things like that. So complements, it's the opposite. These are goods that we don't substitute for each other, but goods we consume together. So let's actually just give a couple of examples, actually one example for each, and then move on. So let's say apples and oranges. And complements, coffee, and what comes with coffee. Some people say sugar, some people say cream, some people say both. I don't put sugar in my coffee, but I do put cream. So coffee and cream. Next thing, the relationship between changes in price for one good and demand for the other good. So if we have two goods, let's say apples and oranges. So if price of one good goes up, what will happen to demand for another good? So demand for oranges. Well, think about real quick. If apples get more expensive, probably you will buy less of them, right? Because the law of demand, price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. And actually apples getting more expensive will make oranges look cheaper, relatively cheaper. Their price stays the same, but in comparison to apples, which are now more expensive, they look cheaper, so people will buy more oranges, or at least this is what we expect to happen. And the other way around. So if two goods are substitutes in consumption, actually, let me add this two substitutes in consumption. I'm putting it down because we're going to talk about substitutes in production, and it's very important not to confuse these two things. So same thing applies to complements. Complements in, again, consumption, because there will be something called complements in production. So when it comes to complements in consumption, then if price of one good, let's say price of coffee goes up, people will buy less of it, right? So they will buy less cream. So as price of coffee goes up, demand for, well, this is kind of unfortunate, same letter, but I'll just write it down like this. So demand for cream will go down. And to make it even more clear, let me show it on a diagram. So for substitutes in consumption, if you have, and this is actually very important to understand how things work graphically here. So we have apples and oranges, right? So we're only going to show things on one diagram. So we're interested in how a change in price for apples going to affect demand for oranges. So that's why this diagram shows us what's going on with oranges. So this is quantity of oranges, this is price of oranges, this is the initial demand for oranges given that price was at certain level. So let's say this is demand when price of apples was at certain level. So PA1, then we assume that price of apples goes up. So price of apples increases. So basically price for apples goes from PA1, well, I did it like this, right, to PA2. So remember, there is no room to show price for apples on this diagram. This is not price of apples. This is price of oranges. We can actually mark it. So, so we are not moving along this curve or this axis. We're actually shifting the entire demand curve for oranges to show how it moves due to increase in change for price of apples. And the way we're gonna do it is we figured out that demand for oranges will increase as price of apples goes up. We'll just shift our demand curve further right. And again, this is demand curve for oranges, given that now price for apples is higher. Okay, this is how things work here. And when it comes to complements, it's the same idea, only of course increasing price for one good actually decreases demand for the other good. So I think I'll just leave this thing for you to figure out. So for complements in consumption, do it yourself. All right, consumption. Okay, and what else we have on the list? I mean, this list definitely is not closed. So, by the way, we're talking about shift factors. But what I just showed on this diagram, that pretty much covers the logic of those changes for every shift factor. So we talked about income, preferences, prices of related goods, number of buyers, right? So you guys look in the textbook and actually make this list for yourself. Well, I guess I put, what was that? Number of buyers. And again, the thing is that, this is number, right? Number of buyers and so on and so forth. Because again, this list is not closed. You need to understand the most important ones. By the way, expectations are on the list as well. But I don't want to bother you to death. We've already been doing this for 18 minutes. So I think I covered the most important stuff here. Make sure you go to the textbook, go to your notes, refresh the list of those shift factors, and make sure you understand this distinction between changes in price that move us along a given demand curve and changes in demand, which shows as a shift in the demand curve. And also, I think this discussion was very important here. All right, so I'll stop here. Thank you very much. I'll see you next time.